It started like any other Tuesday. A little too quiet, maybe, but not the kind of silence that screams. Just the normal kind. The kind that settles into a house when the only two people who bring it to life are somewhere deep in the mountains. Marianne. Beckwith stood by the kitchen counter, staring at the wall clock. 6:59 p.m. The second hand ticked in slow, deliberate arcs. On the stove, a pot of coffee sat untouched, the scent curling gently through the room like a promise waiting to be kept. Garrett had picked that time himself. 7 sharp, he'd said with a smile that only half hid his usual intensity. We'll check in. One of the sat phones will work. Garrett Beckwith didn't leave things to chance. He was the kind of man who checked the weather a week in advance, then packed for all 4 seasons just in case. He made checklists for his checklists. When it came to climbing, he believed preparation was the difference between adventure and obituary, and now, at 7:01, the phone still hadn't rung. Marianne told herself it was nothing. Just a delay. A dead battery. Maybe they were finishing. A pitch. She even chuckled. Mount Hooker isn't exactly a stroll through the park. It's a beast of stone and ice in the heart of Wyoming's Wind River Range. Garrett and Della were probably hauling gear up some insane wall, racing daylight. She told herself all that, but still, she didn't drink the coffee. By 7:30, she was pacing. The kind of pacing that wears down hardwood floors and nerves alike. She picked up her phone, checked the screen, then set it down again, over and over. There were no new messages. Just the last one from Della, sent 4 days ago from the trailhead. Starting the approach, see you in a few days. Love you. Marianne had read it so many times, she could see it with her eyes closed. It had been warm. Alive. Now it felt like a ghost. By Wednesday morning, the silence had teeth. The house felt too big. Too still. Every tick of the clock echoed like a footstep in an empty room. She replayed their trip plan in her mind. Garrett had outlined everything. Starting at Big Sandy. Ascending Hooker from the western couloir. 3 nights, maybe 4, maximum. He had backup routes. He had redundancies, but he didn't have a voice on the line. And that meant something was wrong. 12:16 p.m., with hands that trembled just slightly, Marianne dialed the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. She tried to keep her voice calm, measured. She explained everything. Garrett's experience, Della's strength, the detailed route plan. She recited it like scripture. But beneath the words was a rising current of dread. Because Garrett Beckwith wasn't the kind of man who got lost. For him, that wasn't just unlikely, it was a logical impossibility. The dispatcher's tone stayed steady, professional. But when Marianne said Mount Hooker, there was a beat. A pause, like the kind a doctor gives before reading the test results, and just like that, a case number was created. A priority alert was flagged. A deputy was sent to the Big Sandy trailhead, tasked with confirming the only thing that could be confirmed, the truck. Deputy Miles Corbin had made that drive before. The kind that rattled your bones and turned cell signals into memories. As the dusty road snaked deeper into the Wind River Range, the land peeled back layers of civilization until there was nothing but sky, stone, and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't welcome you. It just watches. He found the parking lot. Mostly empty, as expected. A few hikers' cars. A dusty Subaru. And then, there it was. A dark green Ford F-150, coated in pine pollen and layered with mountain dust. Exactly as described, Corbin parked beside it and stepped out. The air was crisp. Thin. The kind that made your breath feel borrowed. He ran the plates. Garrett Beckwith. Then he approached the truck. Nothing was broken. Nothing was tampered with. Just a quiet, abandoned vehicle that looked like it had been left there hours ago, or weeks. The passenger seat held a folded map and a dog-eared guidebook to the Wind River climbs. No chaos. No blood. No broken glass, just absence. He tried the driver's side door. It clicked open without resistance. Not unusual in places like this. Climbers know it's better to leave a car unlocked than to risk a shattered window for an old jacket or stale snack bar inside. The scent of pine air freshener still lingered. Faint. Familiar. Corbin checked the glove box, expecting nothing. Just routine, but inside, nestled neatly between the registration papers and a folded insurance slip, were 2 sleek, black satellite phones, both turned on. Both fully charged, and just like that, the entire narrative. Broke. It wasn't weather. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't a missed call because of gear failure. It was something else, something that started not on the rock, but here, inside a truck parked neatly beneath the shadow of a deadly mountain. Corbin keyed his radio. His voice was flat. Professional vehicle. Located. Both sat phones found inside. Fully charged. Dispatch responded with static calm. But in the space between those words, a new story had begun. One not of misstep, but of mystery, and miles away, up on that mountain, the clock had already stopped ticking, because even before the search began, the Beckwith's only hope of rescue had been left behind, quiet, cold, and forgotten. The road to Big Sandy Trailhead is long, narrow, and unforgiving. It winds through a nowhere stretch of Wyoming wilderness, a place where pine trees outnumber people 1,000 to 1. The dust hangs thick in the air, clinging to the sides of the patrol vehicle like a second skin. Sheriff's Deputy Miles Corbin keeps one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the radio. The only sound inside the cruiser is the low hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of gear in the back. He's made drives like this before. Lost hikers, overdue campers, the usual calls that come with living at the edge of wild country. But this one feels different. The woman on the phone, Mary Ann Beckwith, didn't sound frantic. She sounded controlled. Too controlled. The kind of calm that only exists when fear has already taken root and grown cold. Her husband, Garrett, and daughter, Della, hadn't checked in. Experienced climbers. Detailed itinerary. Known for over-preparing. And now, nothing. No call. No signal. No sign. Corbin knows these mountains don't care how much gear you carry or how smart you are. They take who they want. But still, something about this one doesn't sit right. As he rounds the final bend, the trailhead comes into view, a flat clearing carved out of the forest, framed by towering peaks that stab the sky. There are only a few cars parked here, and most are coated in the same layer of trail dust. But one stands out. A dark green Ford F-150. Corbin slows the cruiser, pulling alongside. He checks the plate, registered to Garrett Beckwith. The truck is still. Silent. Nature has already begun to reclaim it. Thin lines of yellow pine pollen hug the windshield, and a crust of dust dulls the paint. It doesn't look freshly parked. But it doesn't look abandoned, either. He steps out. The air is sharper here, colder, cleaner. He walks slowly, eyes scanning the vehicle for anything out of place. The windows are closed. No sign of struggle. No broken glass. Just quiet. He peers inside. The cab is clean. Methodical. There's a folded map on the passenger seat, a guidebook for the Wind River Range. A pair of gloves tucked into the door pocket. It looks like someone left for a climb and planned to return. In a few days, Corbin tries the handle. It's unlocked, not unusual. Most climbers don't lock their cars this deep in the backcountry. Better to risk a curious raccoon than a shattered window. He leans in. The air smells faintly of pine and old coffee. It's the kind of scent you only notice when everything else is silent. He opens the glove compartment, and there, sitting neatly beside the registration and an owner's manual, are 2 black satellite phones. He freezes. For a few seconds, his brain doesn't register what he's looking at. Then the weight of it hits. These weren't forgotten in the chaos of an emergency. They weren't stashed away with dead batteries. These were the lifelines, their one connection to the world outside this range, and they're right here. Fully charged. Untouched, Corbin picks one up and presses the power button. The screen flickers to life immediately. Battery. Full. He tries the second. Same thing. His stomach sinks. This wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't a missed opportunity. This was a mistake. A catastrophic one. One that didn't match anything Mary Ann had described about her husband Garrett. Was a safety fanatic. A man who triple-checked his knots, logged every step of his climbs, carried backups for his backups. Leaving the satellite phones behind wasn't just unlikely. It was unthinkable. Corbin steps back from the vehicle, suddenly aware of how loud the forest sounds have become. The wind in the trees. The distant call of a bird. He keys the radio. Dispatch, this is Corbin. I've located the Beckwith vehicle. Confirming registration to Garrett Beckwith. A crackle, then a calm voice responds. Copy that. Any signs of forced entry or distress? He hesitates. Negative. But both satellite phones were found in the glove box. Fully charged. There's a pause. Then, understood. Logging that now. Corbin doesn't say more. He just stands there, looking at the truck, because this moment, the one where a perfectly ordinary glove box reveals the first real fracture in the story, is when everything changes. This isn't just a case of overdue hikers. It's not just bad weather or a broken leg. It's something else. Something bigger, and what lies ahead won't be solved with a search grid and a helicopter. Because the Beckwiths haven't just vanished. They've slipped into a story that won't unravel for 11 more years, and it all started right here, with 2 silent phones, and no one to answer them. The morning light breaks cold over the Wind River Range, casting long shadows across the granite teeth of Mount Hooker. Below, at the big sandy trailhead, what was once a quiet parking lot has transformed into a hive of motion. Trucks roll in, kicking up dust. Helicopters thunder overhead. Volunteers haul maps, radio gear, fuel canisters. The command post is alive with tension. Search and rescue crews know time is the one thing they never have enough of, and on this mountain, time doesn't give second chances. By noon, the first helicopter lifts off. Its rotors slice through the thin mountain air, carrying seasoned spotters armed with binoculars and decades of experience. They sweep along the ridgelines, tracing every contour, every couloir, every glint of color that doesn't belong, but from above, Mount Hooker looks endless. Cold gray stone folds into shadowed cliffs. Snow lingers in the crevices. There are no trails, just raw, ancient earth. You don't climb this mountain by accident, and you don't disappear on it without leaving something behind. Or so they thought. On the ground, elite SAR teams begin the grueling ascent. They call out names. Into the wind, Garrett, Della. Voices echoing, then swallowed whole. They hike from sunup to sundown, combing the most probable paths the Beckwiths could have taken. But the mountain doesn't answer, not with a broken branch, not with a boot print, not with the shine of a zipper in the brush. IT gives them nothing each. Evening, they return to base, faces streaked with salt and exhaustion, heads shaking. There's no wreckage, no tent, no sign, just silence. Marianne Beckwith waits at the edge of the operation. Eyes hollow, hands clenched. Every face she sees returning empty-handed is another cut in her Sol. 1 SAR member, shoulders heavy with gear, passes her and murmurs. He knew what he was doing. If anyone could survive out there, it's Garrett. But the words offer no comfort because experience means nothing to a mountain that doesn't care. By the 4th day, hope is beginning to fray. Maps are spread across truck hoods like battle plans. Experts argue over terrain models. Should they search farther east? Maybe Garrett tried an undocumented route, but speculation feels useless. Even the most likely guesses are drowned in the sheer scale of this place. Then, the sky begins to turn. What starts as a gust becomes a howl. The blue overhead darkens to steel. And just like that, autumn snaps shut. The storm hits faster than anyone expected. Rain turns to sleet. Sleet to snow. The helicopters are grounded. Wind slams against the ridges, icing over rock faces, turning trails into slipstreams of death. On the 6th day, the SAR commander makes the call. Pull them back. We can't risk more lives. His voice is tight. The words fall heavy. The teams descend. Slowly. Bitterly. Some protest. Others say nothing, but the truth is clear. Mount Hooker has closed its doors. What began as a rescue has become a retreat. Back at base, the gear is packed. Radios go quiet. The trucks rumble to life. 1. By 1, the boots leave the mud, and then, the parking lot is empty again, just a single green pickup truck. And a silence so deep it feels like a verdict. The official report lists the Beckwiths as missing, presumed lost in wilderness. The search is reclassified. Scaled down. The urgency is gone, the mountain one, but not for everyone, because as the snow begins to fall, and the command post collapses into memory, one man is already tracing new lines across a map. He's looking at ridges no one else considered. Faces too remote, too technical, too dangerous. He isn't part of the sheriff's office. He doesn't answer to orders. But he knew Garrett Beckwith better than anyone, and to him, the mountain hasn't won. Not yet. The snow hadn't even settled when he arrived. Alistair Finch stood at the edge of the trailhead, his breath a pale cloud in the thin autumn air. The wind had a bite now, but he didn't flinch. He had climbed in worse. What froze him wasn't the cold. It was the truck. Garrett's truck, still there, silent, dusted in frost like a tombstone waiting for an inscription. They'd called off the search. But Alistair knew better. He'd known Garrett Beckwith for over 20 years. Climbed with him. Failed with him. Watched him pull off lines that had no business being climbable. Garrett didn't vanish because he got sloppy. Know if Garrett was still out there, It wasn't on a marked trail. It wasn't in a gully someone, with a clipboard, had circled on a topo map. It was in the places people didn't look. The ghost routes. The lines no one documented because they were too dangerous, too irrational. To Garrett, that night, inside a dim motel room littered with topo maps and old guidebooks, Alistair cracked open a leather-bound journal. Garrett's. One of many Marianne had handed over without a word. Inside, neat pencil lines traced dream. Routes, some real, most imagined. He'd written them down like prayers. Possible line, east face. 1,000 feet sharp ice runnel. No exit. Another one, north spine crack system. Unclimbed. To most, these were scribbles. To Alistair. They were coordinates. By the next morning, he had made calls. Quiet ones. He wasn't interested in red tape or permission. He wanted people who could move fast, climb hard, and keep their mouths shut. 3 days later, they arrived. 5 climbers. All local. All elite. Roped together by respect, not rules. They loaded their own gear. No press. No officials. No fanfare, just a promise. Garrett had gone somewhere nobody else would, so that's where they'd go. The first ascent led them up a sheer, frozen chimney that didn't exist in any guidebook. The kind of wall that made your teeth ache just looking at it. Fingers bled. Rope froze. At night, their breath hung in the tents like fog trapped in plastic. But they kept going. They moved like ghosts, quiet, careful, methodical. They checked. Every ledge wide enough to sit on. Every crack deep enough to shelter a rope or a boot. Each time, they expected to find something. A dropped carabiner. A scrap of gear. A message carved into stone. They found nothing, not even footprints, only silence, and wind that whispered doubts into their helmets. On the 4th day, they reached a section Garrett had once written about but never attempted. A knife-edge ridge, sharp enough to cut rope. Below them, cliffs dropped for hundreds of feet, vanishing into swirling fog. Alistair paused at the edge, fingers wrapped in tape, legs shaking from fatigue. He could almost see Garrett there, grinning, eyes blazing, the wind turning his jacket into a flag. Looks doable, he might have said, but the ridge was clean. No anchors. No marks. No sign. He wasn't here. They searched 5 more days. Faced blizzards, hidden crevasses, near vertical ice slabs. At one point, they lost a pack to the wind. It tumbled into the abyss without a sound. They kept climbing, kept hoping, kept failing. On the 9th morning, they sat in a semicircle around a small fire made from dry lichen and hope. No one spoke. The mountain had taken everything it could, except their will, but even that was fraying. Alistair looked at them one by one. Exhausted. Frost-bitten. Eyes hollow from too many nights pressed against cold granite, waiting for a whisper. From a ghost who wasn't coming back. He stood up, slowly. We go down. There were no protests. They packed in silence. One last sweep. One final call into the void. Garrett. No echo. No answer, just the wind, howling like it had something to hide. They descended slowly, bones aching, hearts heavier than their packs. When they reached the trailhead, Alistair walked past the green truck without looking at it. He knew Garrett hadn't failed. The mountain had simply hidden him too well, and maybe it always would. But the thing about mountains, they don't forget, they just wait. And 3 years later, long after the world had moved on, the wind on Mount Hooker would carry a secret to someone new, someone who was still listening. The creek wasn't on any map. It ran through a remote part of the Wind River Range, far from the usual hiking trails, winding through jagged rocks and low-hanging branches. No one went there, not unless they were already lost, but in 2016, a backpacker did. He wasn't looking for anything, just a quiet place to fish, far from the noise of the world. The water was clear, the sky crisp. He dropped his pack by a mozzie, stone, and waded into the creek, casting his line into the cool, rushing current. That was when he saw it. A glint. A T first. He thought it was a piece of metal caught in the rocks. A scrap of old junk, maybe, from some forgotten time. But when he stepped closer, his heart skipped. It wasn't junk. It was a climbing nut, an expensive piece of gear, smooth and worn by years of use, but still unmistakable. He crouched down, reaching carefully to pull it free from the rocks. His mind clicked into place. Garrett Beckwith's name came to him in an instant. It wasn't just any climbing gear. It was the kind Garrett used. The kind he swore by. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew enough to realize that this wasn't a random find. This wasn't something you stumbled upon by accident. It was a clue. The backpacker carefully placed it in his bag, thinking he might be onto something. He didn't realize it then, but he was holding the key to reopening a door that had been shut tight for 3 years. Back at the sheriff's office, the discovery of the climbing nut reignited a spark. Investigators looked at it, cross-referenced the brand, and came to the same conclusion. It matched the gear Garrett had used. It was the same model, the same brand, the same quality. But there was no serial number. No clear way to prove it belonged to him. Just a piece of gear, pulled from the creek, miles from Mount Hooker. It wasn't enough. The case wasn't solved with a flash of metal in the water. It wasn't the breakthrough they were hoping for. It was another dead end. Days passed. The paperwork was filed away. The rumor of the found gear faded as quickly as it had flared. Another failed lead. Another reminder of how the wilderness holds its secrets close. The clock ticked on, and the mountain remained silent. But the truth? The truth was still there. Hiding, waiting. It didn't know how to hide in a forgotten corner of the internet, deep in a dusty, neglected forum where climbers shared their routes, stories, and sometimes their suspicions. There was a post. One sentence. A simple theory that began to spread like wildfire, whispered in corners of the web. No one cared to look. Someone had connected the dots. They'd linked the climbing nut to Garrett, and to his mysterious disappearance. And then came the suggestion. The dangerous suggestion. What if it wasn't an accident? The theory caught fire quickly. Maybe Garrett had staged the whole thing. Maybe he was trying to escape. His family, his debts, something no one knew about. The poster suggested that maybe Garrett hadn't fallen or gotten lost. Maybe he'd gone off the grid on purpose. And maybe, just maybe, Della had been collateral damage in his plan. It was baseless. It was cruel. But it was out there, rattling around like a stone in a tin can, and the worst part? It wasn't just whispered in secret anymore. The idea began to circulate beyond the forum. It spread like ink spilling across a page, reaching reporters, bloggers, and even the local media. Garrett's name, once synonymous with meticulous planning and safety, was being dragged through the mud. The thought that he could be responsible for his daughter's death, his own disappearance, stuck in the air like a foul stench. And Marianne? She didn't know about the rumors yet. She didn't know that her husband's name was being tarnished by a theory with no foundation. But soon, she would. And it would break her. The story wasn't over. Not yet, because the mountain, in all its silence and cruelty, had not given up its secrets. It was only waiting for someone to listen. It started in a forgotten corner of the internet, an old, dusty forum where climbing enthusiasts shared their victories and defeats, their routes, and their secrets. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect a storm to begin. But there, buried between a dozen irrelevant posts about gear and trail conditions, one user posed a simple question. What if Garrett Beckwith staged his disappearance? The words hung in the air, starting as a murmur, a flicker of doubt. But the suggestion wasn't just a passing thought. It grew. It spread. Maybe Garrett had been in financial trouble, the post continued. Maybe he was trying to escape something, debts, a failing business, and Della got caught in the middle. The theory was dark. Impossible, even. But it was out there. And like a spark in dry grass, it caught fire. The idea took root in the shadows of the web, growing more elaborate with every retelling. Some said Garrett had faked his own death, staging the climb to Mount Hooker as a final escape. Others suggested he had planned everything, even the accident. They whispered that he may have killed Della as part of his twisted escape, that her death was a consequence of his desperation, and soon, it wasn't just a conspiracy in a forgotten forum. It was spreading into blogs, news outlets, and whispers in coffee shops. People who had never even seen Garrett began to speculate on his life, on his choices, on his failures. They painted him as a man who would sacrifice his daughter for freedom. The damage was done. It reached Marianne, too. The first time she heard it was over the phone, a voice shaking with uncertainty. The woman on the other end had asked if she was aware of the theory circulating online, that Garrett might have been responsible for Della's death, that he had staged the whole thing. The words pierced her like a knife. She didn't even respond at first, just sat there in silence, a cold shock washing over her. The thought of it was too much to bear. How could they say that? How could they believe that? Garrett, the man who had always been there for her, the man who would never let anything happen to Della. But the rumors were out there. And now, they were forcing action. In response to the growing accusations, investigators were forced to reopen the case. They delved into Garrett's finances, looking for any shred of evidence that might confirm the theory. They sifted through every receipt, every bank statement, every credit card transaction. They scoured loan applications, looking for signs of desperation, anything that could show he was running from something. But they found nothing. The records didn't match the story being told online. Garrett's business was steady, his debts minimal, and his life insurance policy, though substantial, wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Everything checked out. There was no sign of financial collapse, no secret stash of cash, no hidden escape plan. It was all normal, ordinary, even another dead end. The case grew colder. The online theory had been nothing more than a wild accusation, baseless, cruel, and entirely unfounded. And yet, its shadow hung over the investigation like a dark cloud, preventing anyone from seeing the truth clearly. For Marianne, it was like losing Garrett and Della all over again. Her life had been torn apart once, and now, in the eyes of some, they were questioning everything she had believed about him. The rumor had created a fracture, one that couldn't be fixed by paperwork or apologies. And so, the Beckwith case was left to gather dust once more, but Mount Hooker, the mountain that had taken Garrett and Della, wasn't done. Never is 11 years past, the case slipping further and further into cold obscurity. But in 2024, a faint breath of wind, a gust across a forgotten ledge, would stir the silence. A hiker, far from the beaten path, stumbled across a strange, out-of-place sight. A scrap of fabric, grey and faded, flapping weakly against the stone. Curious, he climbed closer, his heart racing at the sight. A portal edge. Old, abandoned, and within it, a sleeping bag. Stiff and cracked from the years, but unmistakably human. The hiker's hand trembled as he reached inside, pulling out what lay inside the bag. A skeleton. A human skull, and suddenly, the case that had remained unsolved for over a decade wasn't cold anymore. It was alive with new questions, new hope, new fear. Because in that moment, the mountain had finally whispered its truth. Garrett Beckwith's story was far from finished. The mountain had kept its secret hidden for years, but now, it was about to reveal its final chapter. The sun was beginning its slow descent when Chloe Vance and Ben Carter reached the face of Mount Hooker. They had been pushing hard for 2 days, their bodies aching, their minds clouded by exhaustion, but they were driven by something else now, a pull, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with the climb itself. They weren't just conquering rock, they were chasing a mystery that had haunted the mountain for over a decade. The wind was picking up as they climbed higher, pulling at their gear, making each step harder than the last. They were alone here, far from the crowds, the kind of place where you could forget the world existed. The kind of place Garrett Beckwith would have known. They reached a small ledge, high above the valley, when Ben's voice cut through the wind, tight with disbelief. "Chloe, look at this." She turned, expecting to see another crag or overhang, but her eyes locked on something that made her stomach lurch. A portal edge, a suspended camping platform, was bolted into the rock wall, abandoned, half hidden in the shadows. "It's old," she muttered, the words lost to the wind, but the sight was undeniable. This wasn't just any camp. It was something different. Something forgotten. She carefully approached the ledge, stepping around loose rock, her breath shallow in the cold air. Ben followed, his face pale in the dimming light. Neither of them had expected to find something like this, a piece of the past, tied to a tragedy they hadn't yet understood. The portal edge was bolted securely into the granite, its fabric faded, brittle from years of exposure to the harsh elements. There was a coil of old, stiff rope lying neatly in the corner, and beside it, a blue dry bag, cracked with age, as if time itself had been waiting to reveal it. Chloe's heart began to race. Something wasn't right. She reached for the zipper of the sleeping bag that lay within the portal edge. It was stiff, resistant, like it hadn't been moved in years. The air seemed to grow heavier around her. Every second stretching longer, thicker. With a final tug, the zipper gave way, and she pulled it open. The first thing she saw was the clothes, a jacket, some layers. But underneath, something else. Something human. Her breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, her mind spinning. Her fingers trembled as she reached down and gently pulled the fabric apart, revealing the skull nestled on a makeshift pillow. Of clothes. Its empty socket seemed to stare right through her, frozen in a quiet scream that had lasted for years. Chloe recoiled, her pulse pounding in her ears. She stumbled back, almost losing her balance on the edge of the cliff. Ben, seeing her reaction, rushed forward, his own face draining of color. What the hell is this? He whispered. They both stood there, staring at the remains in the sleeping bag. A sense of unease washed over them, chilling them deeper than the wind ever could. This was no ordinary discovery. It's a body, Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. But who? Ben stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold air, his gaze fixed on the remains. It's Della Beckwith, he said, more to himself than to her. This is Della. Chloe felt a lump form in her throat. She had read about the Beckwith case. Everyone had. Garrett and Della had gone missing years ago on Mount Hooker, and the search had been called off after a few weeks. The story had faded from the headlines, replaced by other tragedies, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't a story anymore. This was real. But how had Della ended up here, so high on the mountain, alone in this remote ledge? Chloe's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the story she had heard, about a father's obsession with safety, his meticulous planning. Garrett had been known as one of the best. The kind of climber who didn't make mistakes, but something had gone terribly wrong. Della's leg had been shattered, a break so severe that she couldn't move. Garrett had done what any parent would. He had secured her as best he could in a place where she would be safe, sheltered from the biting winds, and left her behind. He had gone for help. Chloe felt a pang in her chest, a sudden wave of sorrow for a family that had been torn apart by the mountain. But Garrett never returned. The wind howled around them, carrying the weight of something unsaid. Chloe and Ben exchanged a look, a silent understanding of the tragedy they had just uncovered. They had found Della, but Garrett was still out there. Somewhere. Alone. Ben carefully took out his phone and snapped pictures, documenting everything, knowing they couldn't touch anything more. This wasn't just a find, it was a crime scene. They were about to leave when Chloe froze, her eyes catching something below them, 500 feet down the cliff face. A small, rusted piton had been hammered into the rock. It looked old, worn, almost forgotten. But it was there. One last clue. One desperate line traced by Garrett's hand. Chloe's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. Garrett had been here. He had descended this rock face, trying to find a way down, trying to find help. And now, this piton, this last trace of him, was all that remained of the man who had tried so desperately to save his daughter. But where had he gone from there? What had happened to him? The piton was just the beginning, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Chloe and Ben stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what they had discovered pressing down on them. They knew they couldn't stay here. They had to get down the mountain, get back to civilization. But the answers to this mystery were still scattered across the jagged face of Mount Hooker, and so, with heavy hearts, they began their descent, knowing that the mountain had given up only part of its truth. The rest, Garrett's story, the answer to what had happened, was still locked away, hidden beneath the endless stone and snow and the mountain. It was still waiting. The day was calm, almost eerily so. The wind was low. The clouds stretched thin across the sky as the biologist guided his drone over the rugged terrain of the Wind River Range. His mission was simple: survey the area for bighorn sheep. It was a routine task, one that had been done 1,000 times before, but today, his eyes lingered on the screen, scanning the landscape with an intensity he couldn't quite explain, and then, the flash of color caught his EYET first, it seemed. Insignificant, just another pile of rocks in a remote basin, far from the well-worn paths and distant from the official search zones. But as he zoomed in, something more caught his attention. A patch of blue, fabric-worn and faded by time. It looked like it shouldn't belong, something out of place, like a piece of forgotten history. His heart skipped. He sent the drone lower, bringing it closer to the rock-strewn basin. That's when he saw it. The bones scattered among the jagged rocks, almost as if they had been left to scatter by the wind itself. Pieces of a story no one had yet uncovered. A skull. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. His gut tightened as his mind connected. The dots, Garrett Beckwith. The missing climber. The one they had all assumed was lost to the mountain, his fate sealed in the void of unforgiving cliffs. The pieces, scattered now, were too significant to ignore. His hand shook as he maneuvered. The drone, zooming in further, careful not to disrupt the delicate balance of the scene unfolding before him. He knew what this meant. The search, the one that had been called off years ago, was about to be reopened. He marked the coordinates, set the drone to hover, and made the call. The authorities arrived days later, a small team of specialists equipped for this kind of terrain. Helicopters thundered through the air. their blades a rhythmic, ominous sound as they descended into the remote basin. The rocky outcrop stood as silent and immovable as ever, and beneath it, the bones waited. The recovery team moved in carefully, each step calculated. The remains were fragile, delicate, and scattered across the jagged rocks. They worked in silence, their movements deliberate as they began collecting the evidence. The bones were meticulously catalogued, piece by piece, each one telling a story of its own, of a final struggle, of a desperate fight against the elements that had ultimately taken its toll, and then, as the team sifted through the debris, one of them found it, the titanium plate, wedged between the shattered remains of Garrett's jaw. It was unmistakable that it was Garrett Beckwith. The confirmation sent a chill through the group, a sense of dread that seemed to permeate the air itself. The man who had once been the epitome of safety, of preparation, had found himself lost in the one place he had mastered. The mountain, silent and indifferent, had finally given up its secret. The report filed soon after was simple, clinical. Garrett Beckwith had died alone in the basin, disoriented and far off course. He had wandered into a natural trap, a place that was as much of a death sentence as it was a home for lost souls. There was no foul play, no one to blame but the unforgiving wild that had taken him in. But for those who knew him, those who had searched for him, believed in him, the story wasn't over. Not yet. The mountain had claimed him, but it hadn't claimed the questions that still lingered in the air. The one thing everyone kept asking, the question that still echoed across the empty valleys of Mount Hooker, was this: why had Garrett left the satellite phones in the truck? He had been prepared for everything. He had planned for every contingency. But those phones, his lifeline, had been left behind. A simple oversight, or something more. It was a detail so small, yet so profound, that it remained unanswered. And it left the story unfinished, the truth hidden beneath the layers of granite and snow, waiting for someone to find it. The wind howled through the cliffs, and for a moment, it felt like Garrett's voice was still there, carried on the gusts of the mountain, whispering the answers no one had yet uncovered.